Welcome, Internet, the psychologist casual review, and today I wanted to talk about a very short and somewhat very contemporary article I've read. Contemporary not because it was written recently, but because the themes and the topics it talks about are, I think, very common to nowadays, and something that I've seen at least in the last 10 years really start to blow up, namely this question of politics and the question of civilization. So this article is a very, very interesting discussion by Ernest Jones on how civilization can be saved. And if you've ever read any psychoanalysis ever, you know that he's not really going to answer the question, because that's how psychoanalysis works. With those broad topics, it's kind of very clickbaity, even if there was no clickbait at the time, but it's like they're going to put forward a grand question and proceed very thoroughly not to answer it, or not to answer it in the way that we as an audience would expect. And that's what I like with those old texts, is that they kind of spin the question, so it gets your gears and your intelligence and your thinking rolling on those topics. So why did I think it very modern? So I'm going to structure this review in two parts. The first part is going to be just basically me paraphrasing the text. And the second is why I feel that it's really a quite contemporary text, even though it's been written 8 years ago. So first and foremost, in this text, Ernest Jones on how civilization can be saved starts out by saying that he was asked that's not necessarily something he would have want to discuss on its own, and he feels that those questions, those grand questions, all-encompassing questions, are pretty deceitful, because he basically compares it to medicine, and he brings it back to medicine, not even to psychoanalysis, but really to medicine, as he was a medical doctor. He said that basically those questions remind him of a dynamic in medical science itself between what he calls good doctors and bad doctors. I just want to make sure here, I am not a doctor, a medical doctor. I don't know anything about medicine. That's really Ernest Jones's point of view. I want to make it very clear. So for him, the good doctors are doctors that do not precipitate themselves to give an answer and to try and relieve the patient of his symptoms directly. He says that those types of doctors that really want to cut out the pain, the suffering, and not think about the diagnosis, not think about how the patient is going. Those doctors, contrary to what people may think, are bad doctors, because they just precipitate themselves. They don't take the time to really evaluate things, but really try and cut short in response to what one thinks is the emergency of the patient. And he said that often it doesn't really end really well, because they try and go too fast, and they don't really answer anything by going that fast. On the other hand, there is what he calls good doctors. Doctors that are not necessarily going to jump in or be, too quick to start prescribing, but are really going to take the time to analyze the situation, get to the context, understand the reason, even sometimes not prescribe anything at the current situation. And basically he says that those doctors that are going to take the time, think things through, think things over, are good doctors. And in this sense, that question of how civilization can be saved is a bit of the same, because he says that people that are going to go out of their way to provide a direct answer without truly understanding the ins and outs are in the wrong. At least according to Jones, they're in the wrong. They're not thinking things through, and they want to find what he calls a panacea to society's problems. And what Ernest Jones in this text makes very clear is that he thinks that the reason why he was asked is that we're in the 1940s and the Second World War is raging, and there is concern that might destroy humanity or civilization. It's something that he brushes aside, saying that it will not be destroyed. It might be changed, but it won't be destroyed per se. And that's something that I found very interesting. Like, he doesn't give in the catastrophizing, sorry, hard word to say. And he, on the contrary, he even goes on the route of, like, there are two types of knowledge, one that's emotional and one that's intellectual. The intellectual one needs to answer the questions, and the emotional one can be useful if you need to do something, but it also comes at the risk of having an acute answer that's not right, but just is there because it needs to be relieved, and it's anxiety relieving. And he says that the problem with people that give solutions on how to save the world is that those people often want it as a remedy to their anxiety. And it's not necessarily that it's the right way of doing it, or the good way, or even something that's doable. It's there to fill up their sense of self and push back the anxiety on what is happening. And he says that on the contrary, one should analyze the phenomena to its fullest, rather than try and find a panacea. And then he explains that basically he is not a fool. He understands that the situation is dire and that it's incredibly complicated. So here in this article, he's going to explicitly speak about fascism, Nazism, and a lot of stuff going on. Of course, it's in the midst of the war, so not everything is known as we know it now. But there is that idea that fascism is at a point where it might take over, and because it was written like in the early 40s, so at least 43 was when it was published, so it might have been written even before. The speech might have even been given before 43, right? So not that anyone was sure of how it was going to go, really. So he says in this article that basically the problem with those movements like fascism is that they are completely ingrained in an emotional response. They have kicked out the knowledge part of it. And now he says that it goes back, it has gone, people with those ideologies have regressed to a psychotic state of mind. That's his way of phrasing it. That's not me like pushing my agenda. It's really his words. It's a psychotic state of mind in which basically they feel that everything wrong with the world is in an outside object, that they are not wrong at all, that there's nothing bad with them, it's only with the external world, and that's why they fight it. And he says it's of no use to try and convince them, because it's so emotionally massive that they're not going to back down, and reason can't make a dent into it because it's not built to really make a dent. It's only there to try and explain phenomena, but those people are not interested in any other explanation than what they have come up with. And he says that there's also a problem that when people, and he goes back to Freud, but when people go into groups, and especially in those groups where critical thinking is seen as a bad thing or as something that's a form of betrayal, basically those people are going to give all their authority to the leader. The leader is going to become a representation of their ideal, and they are themselves going to become completely dependent, both ideologically but also in terms of thinking, in terms of decision making, to the leader. The leader is the one that makes all the decisions. And he says that the role of the leader is an impossible one to hold with time, because basically it's such a high standard that anything else is going to make it crumble. So basically all the leader has to become incredibly authoritarian, aggressive and violent. Or the leader is at risk of becoming flawed, perceived as flawed, as weak, as stupid, and therefore substituted with another leader. He says that those mechanisms are basically very paranoid, and that paranoia is something that has completely influenced the whole of basically an authoritarian regime, and in this case, in the case he states of Nazism. And he says that it's not just like that ideology, he like uses it as an example, but it's all the ideologies where someone gives up their critical thinking to a leader, which becomes wrong and potentially a travesty of freedom and more of a security and destructive based approach. And I completely agree with that. I think that basically those people who give themselves up to a cause that's destructive do it because in a way the sense of self is very fragile, and that's how he ends the article. He ends on the fact that saying that violence, abrupt violence that is not there as a limit or there because someone else has pushed them so far that dialogue is not possible, but really violence as the first reaction is not a sign of strength. It's pure weakness. And when he says weakness, it's not physical weakness, of course, it's intellectual, psychic weakness. That the person has no words and they has to resort to an acting out, an aggression to show any form of superiority, which hides, of course, a deep sense of inferiority. And that's something that I find very true. This is where we're going to go to the second part. This is where I felt that this whole article was very contemporary, even though he wrote it 80 years ago. It's because in our world there's so many problems, so much hate has come back that questions like should we talk with people who are embedded in hate? Should we try and even convince them? Are discussions I've heard recently, both on the internet, in my personal life, even sometimes in a professional setting. Those are questions who are still very relevant. And for Jones, he does bring an answer. He doesn't say how we save civilization, but he does say it's not worth it. Those people can't be talked about, can't be reasoned with. They're too far gone, which, I mean, I don't have much examples, but I do think it rings of something true, that once someone has set their minds to a cause, to finding absolute evil into someone else, there's no reasoning back with that person. It's an emotional response that's so powerful that you can't really dismantle it with reasons. And of course, some people might say, well, this is always facts and logic that will impede they hate. No, facts and logic do not impede anything. They're ineffective, really, because once you go to a certain level of hate, logic, reality just becomes a burden that you just push away, and you create your own reality, your own delusional way of seeing things. Because it's much easier to answer the question of hate with a delusion than going within to try and answer it. And that's the whole point, and that's something I completely agree with Jones, is that going within to find the answer is so much harder than projecting and trying to find a cause externally, because external causes can be a blank projection screen for everything. Going within is much more painful, much more subtle, much more question producing. And I think that's something that those people, in a way, are too mentally fragile to try and attempt. So therefore everything goes into the external world. So I felt that the article was so contemporary, and I really liked also how Jones takes the time, like he tries to be at least one of those good doctors that try and go into reason why, rather than an acting out of like here's the bullet points of how we should act to save the world. In a way, he's much more nuanced, and he feels it's something that's need of discussion, that we at an individual level can't necessarily save civilization itself. That's not possible. And he really puts it very clearly. And I think that that's in our world where there's a lot of pressure for us to do everything and anything we can to try and save society from injustice, from climate change, from this, from that. I think that in a way he answers it like there's not much you can do. I mean, he doesn't say you shouldn't do it. At no point does he say that. So he does imply that you should, but it's not your fault if you can't, because there's only so much you can do as an individual. And he also states that he is very surprised that politicians or people in power never are ever tested in any psychological way or have never undergone analysis. And I find that funny because that's kind of something I thought about when I was a student. But growing up, I've realized that they would still transform it, they would still, the bad people would still fake it. I mean, there's no way that it would be a bulletproof response to bad politicians or bad leaders, right? I mean, psychoanalysis can't save us from that. And I'm pretty sure psychoanalysis can't save itself. So, I mean, that's my point of view, at least, on this subject. But I found the article to be very good, and I really recommend it if you are in any way, shape, or form interested in what's happening now with the movements of the far right gaining more and more power, or how our civilization is starting to stare in a quite worrying way. So it's very interesting, and I think it kind of answers, without being a panacea, a lot of questions. Anyway, I hope you found the video interesting. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!